Boa noite. Ele diz que o mundo tem uma preocupação obsessiva com o presente atualmente e que só nós estamos atentos aos índices econômicos e que, por isso, perdemos o senso de responsabilidade em relação ao futuro. Estamos nos comportando como se não tivéssemos filhos. O Roda Viva entrevista esta noite Lester Brown, um dos mais influentes pensadores do movimento ambientalista internacional. Ele é presidente e fundador do World Watch Institute, entidade não governamental sediada em Washington, dedicada à observação, pesquisa e troca de conhecimentos científicos sobre as questões do meio ambiente. Lester Brown é formado em Ciências Agrícolas com mestrado em Economia Agrícola e Administração Pública. Já atuou como analista e assessor de órgãos do governo americano na área de agricultura e até 1974, quando fundou o World Watch. É autor de quase 2 dezenas de livros, além de revistas e publicações anuais, como o State of the World, editado em várias línguas e que se tornou uma espécie de bíblia do movimento ambiental internacional. Para entrevistar Lester Brown, nós convidamos João Paulo Capobianco, biólogo, ambientalista e coordenador do Instituto Socioambiental e pesquisador da Unicamp. Marcelo Leite, repórter especial da Folha de São Paulo. Fernando Rios, jornalista, publicitário e consultor de empresas na área de comunicação e meio ambiente. O físico J.W. Barutista Vidal. Lia de Souza, coordenadora de pauta do programa Repórter Eco da TV Cultura. Regina Scharf, repórter de meio ambiente do jornal Gazeta Mercantil. E o economista Walter Bellick, coordenador do Núcleo de Economia Agrícola da Unicamp. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional para todos os estados brasileiros e também para Brasília. Hoje você não pode participar do programa, porque ele foi gravado, permitindo assim que as respostas de Brown sejam legendadas e que a gente tenha a compreensão total do que se segue. Boa noite. No seu trabalho sobre essa estado do mundo, recentemente publicado, há um capítulo que fala sobre as perspectivas aí de se criar uma economia sustentável, capítulo número 10, e ali é citada a frase de H.G. Wells, que diz o seguinte: a história humana se tornou cada vez mais uma corrida entre a educação e a catástrofe. E a sensação que eu fiquei lendo esse fantástico relatório, extremamente cheio de dados e de avaliações sobre a nossa situação ambiental, é de que, no que se toca ao retrato da perspectiva da catástrofe, o relatório é extremamente denso, completo. Fica faltando, na sensação que eu tenho, entender como é que a gente vai evitar que nesta corrida entre catástrofe e educação, a gente perca ela para a catástrofe. Em outras palavras, toda hora em que vai se analisar as soluções propostas, as alternativas, parecem depender de milhares de pequenas iniciativas e não de uma solução única, né? Quando a gente sabe, e eu estou me estendendo na pergunta, na verdade, quando a gente sabe que por trás de boa parte dessa desrespeito ao meio ambiente existe um objetivo maior, que é ganhar dinheiro. São empresas interessadas em ganhar dinheiro que desrespeitam normas de bom senso, muitas vezes em outros países, aqui no Brasil, inclusive, normas legais que existem já, né, para ganhar dinheiro. Então, a pergunta é essa: como é que é possível evitar a catástrofe e convencer essas empresas de que é possível ganhar menos dinheiro e durar mais tempo a nossa humanidade?
The question is probably not less profit, but how to build an economy where economic progress can continue. If we look around the world now, and as we do when we do the State of the World report each year, we in effect give the Earth an annual physical, the same sort of physical you get when you go to your doctor, checked your vital signs. And what we have seen in the 17 years that we've been doing the report is that each year the health of the patient deteriorates. And we see the signs of deterioration, shrinking forests, collapsing fisheries, disappearing species, rising CO2 levels, continuing rapid population growth, soil erosion, dying coral reefs. One can go down the list. And we know that if these trends continue, that the economy's support systems will, if they continue to deteriorate, that eventually the economy itself will deteriorate. We study the archaeological sites today of earlier civilizations that found themselves on an economic path that was environmentally unsustainable. In the Middle East, for example, the ancient Mesopotamian civilization, the most advanced civilization at that time. They had invented writing, they had written language. They were probably as excited about that as we are about the internet. The first carefully designed cities. This was an advanced civilization based on irrigation, but they had one mistake in the design of their irrigation system, which was they did not design it to avoid the rise in water tables. And this eventually led to waterlogging and salting of their cropland, and their food supply began to deteriorate. And today, the area where this civilization thrived is a wasteland. We can look at other civilizations, the Mayan civilization in Central America, in what are now the lowlands of Guatemala. There were more people there in the year 900 than there are today. A thriving civilization that collapsed, apparently because of deforestation and soil erosion. And we can go down the list, but history is very clear that if we begin to destroy the environmental support systems, whether it's irrigation or forests or soils, then we'll be in trouble. Another dramatic example is North Africa. North Africa was once the breadbasket for Rome. The citizens of Rome ate the wheat, lived on the wheat that was produced in North Africa. It was a major food surplusing region, and it must have had highly productive soils given the level of technology in those days. Today, it's mostly desert. It's gone. It's no longer a breadbasket for the world.
Mas tudo isso não justamente reforça a ideia de que caminhamos para uma catástrofe. O que eu queria entender, aonde a gente pode acreditar que não chegaremos a essa catástrofe, que isso não vai acontecer, na medida em que cada produtor individual, cada grande empresa, às vezes, um pequeno empresário de um país pouco desenvolvido, ele está pouco interessado em saber se as florestas estão se acabando. O que ele quer é resolver o problema imediato dele. Quer dizer, essa consciência do longo prazo e essa visão de que as coisas precisam mudar, porque senão iremos para o buraco, como se diz, existe em muitas pessoas, mas ela não determina as nossas decisões, nossas da sociedade, as decisões econômicas e principalmente as decisões políticas.
This is one of the responsibilities of government. Historically, when the global economy was very small compared to the size of the Earth, growth was good. There was no problems with growth. But when we begin pressing against the limits of forests and fisheries and soils and water resources, then we have to begin redesigning the system. And government necessarily must play an important role. We think the most important policy instrument available to governments in the world today to restructure the economy, for example, to reduce carbon emissions, is to restructure the tax system. Today, governments tax income very heavily, individual income, corporate income, but we should not be taxing those heavily because those are good things. We want people to work. We want people to save. We want corporations to make money and to have income. What we don't want are environmentally destructive activities, whether it's CO2 emissions that disrupt the Earth's climate system, the discharge of toxic wastes, the generation of huge amounts of garbage, the destruction of forests, the destruction of plant and animal species, the biological diversity of the planet. So what we need is a restructuring of the tax system. So we tax environmentally destructive activities and discourage those and encourage environmentally constructive activities. So this is, you're quite right, individual businesses by themselves cannot fashion an effective response. Government needs to be involved. But the businesses and the individuals like you and I can support governments in their efforts to bring about these changes.
Regina?
O terceiro mundo quer consumir. Hoje ele consome muito abaixo das suas necessidades. Mas se ele acompanhar o padrão de consumo dos países ricos, provavelmente vai ser a destruição final do planeta. Como equilibrar essa questão? Quer dizer, como elevar o nível da população e sem que isso seja excessivo?
The question is not so much how much we consume, but how we produce what we consume. I could give a number of examples. Consider, this is an example that comes from outside the environmental community. In the United States, in Atlanta, Georgia, there is a large carpet manufacturer. It produces industrial carpet for offices and corporate buildings, not for residential purposes. The head of this organization, this carpet manufacturing company, which has production facilities in 9 countries and markets in more than 100 countries. It's a big company. He began worrying about the environmental issues and said, what can I do in my company to change the system, to make it environmentally sustainable, to help build an economic system that will permit economic progress to continue? And he said, what we will do is we will not sell carpet. We will sell carpeting services. We will contract with companies to carpet their offices, for example, for, say, 10 years. And we will maintain the carpeting. If the carpeting wears out, we will replace it. But when the carpeting wears out, it goes back to the factory. And whether it's nylon or polyester, it's melted down again, respun into fiber, re-dyed, and goes back on the floor someplace. So what this change does is it eliminates the need for raw material because you're always using the carpeting in the system. And nothing goes to the landfill. There's no waste from this process. He has figured out a way to close the cycle. So it's not whether our offices or our homes are carpeted, but how we manufacture the carpets that we use. We can carpet homes everywhere. That's not the issue with very good carpeting, if we do it in a way that's environmentally sustainable. And what he has done for this economy, and his goal, incidentally, is not to lose a single molecule of carpeting material. He's closing the cycle. It just stays within the cycle. And this is basically what we have to think about, how to do this for the global economy. How do we restructure it so that it can satisfy our needs, but not self-destruct in the process, which is what is happening at present.
O grande gerador de empregos, então, seria o setor de serviços, não tanto a indústria, a produção de bens materiais.
It would still be manufacturing, but it would be recycled manufacturing rather than using virgin raw materials. And it may be more labor intensive because many of the industries that recycle and reuse are more labor intensive and less raw materials intensive, obviously, than the ones we have today. One of the reasons that the German government, the new coalition government, is restructuring its tax system, reducing income taxes and increasing energy taxes, is to increase the energy efficiency of the economy and also to encourage the development of alternative energy sources like wind power, which is now becoming a major energy source in northern Germany, for example. So the environmentally sustainable economy that we can now see, we know what it looks like, we can describe it in some detail, is one that is more labor intensive. And it also represents an enormous investment opportunity. If we restructure the existing global economy, the fossil fuel-based automobile-centered throwaway economy, into a new economy that is environmentally sustainable, it not only will be a much more pleasant economy, but it also will be an enormous investment opportunity, the greatest investment opportunity in history. There's never been anything like it.
Então, Lester, mas essa questão, voltando ainda, insistindo um pouco nessa pergunta da Regina, na verdade, hoje, os Estados Unidos consomem ou produzem 25% de todo o carbono jogado na atmosfera do planeta. Portanto, um país com uma população relativamente pequena é responsável por 25% da poluição. Isso significa que este país tem um padrão de consumo extremamente alto. E a resposta que o senhor deu até agora trata de mudanças no processo de produção. Mas a pergunta que nós nos colocamos a cada dia que passa é se bastará uma mudança no processo de produção ou se será necessária uma mudança do padrão de consumo, ou seja, uma redução do consumo, uma redução da produção, para que outros países emergentes, países do terceiro mundo, possam também produzir e poluir, porque será uma consequência da sua produção, por mais bem feito do ponto de vista técnico que isso ocorra, haverá uma emissão de carbono, por exemplo, isso é inevitável. Então, de que forma pode-se buscar uma ação política que permita que os países que mais produzem, mais consomem, reduzam esse padrão para que outros países possam produzir mais, ter melhor condição de vida e o equilíbrio do planeta ser alcançado?
You're quite right that the United States, which has 5% of the world's population, accounts for at least 25% of CO2 emissions. The United States is almost single-handedly disrupting the Earth's climate system. The question is not so much how much energy we consume, but how we produce that energy, where that energy comes from. The exciting thing now is that in the United States, we're seeing extraordinary growth in wind power, for example. What we see happening over the long term is that the fossil fuel-based economy of today will be replaced by a solar/hydrogen economy. And by solar, I'm defining that broadly to include everything from biomass, wood, alcohol fuels, to wind power, solar cells, et cetera. And what we now see happening is the reason the world uses fossil fuels is because when we buy a gallon of gasoline, we only pay part of the cost of using the gasoline, the cost of getting the oil out of the ground, refining it, and distributing the gasoline to the service station. That's what we pay for. We do not pay for the air pollution and the health problems associated with. We don't pay for the acid rain damage, and we don't pay for the climate change and disruption in the global climate system. What a carbon tax would do is to include the additional costs of burning fossil fuels so that when we buy a gallon of gasoline, we would pay the full costs, not just the direct costs. Once that begins to happen, that's why restructuring the tax system is so important. Once that begins to happen, then the whole investment pattern in energy begins to change. And we're seeing enormous growth worldwide now in wind energy. It's been growing during the 90s at 22% a year. Coal is growing at 0%, oil and natural gas at 2% each. But wind energy is growing very fast. And in many places in the world, it is now undercutting coal in terms of cost. Using the new high-tech wind turbines, it's extraordinarily efficient, and there's an enormous potential. The Department of Energy in the United States, for example, has done a national wind resources inventory. Their conclusion is, this is the US government speaking, that 3 states, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Texas, have enough harnessable wind energy to satisfy national electricity needs. Once we get cheap electricity from wind, then we can use that to electrolyze water and produce hydrogen. Hydrogen then becomes the basic fuel. That's why we talk about a solar/hydrogen economy. The exciting thing is that now even some oil company executives are beginning to talk about the need to shift from a carbon-based, i.e. fossil fuel-based economy, to a hydrogen-based economy. They're beginning to see this. I gave a talk at the annual conference of oil companies internationally last year, and I talked about this transition. But it's not just me anymore. Even people in the industry are talking about it. So the question is not so much how much energy we produce and use, but how we produce it and whether or not it's environmentally disruptive. The exciting thing about wind is it does not alter the Earth's climate. It doesn't generate any pollutants. So this is the direction of the future. It's not necessarily how much we consume, but how we produce what we consume. And if we produce it in an environmentally sustainable way, then everyone will be able to enjoy a good standard of living and a healthy lifestyle.
Batista.
Se nós levarmos em consideração essa hipótese que a necessidade de ganhar dinheiro leva irremediavelmente à catástrofe, nós estamos admitindo que a humanidade tem uma tendência suicida e que os agentes econômicos são delinquentes. Eu não acredito nessa hipótese. Eu acredito mais na análise que, na publicação do World Watch de 1990, Lester Brown faz a seguinte afirmação.
80, né?
Não, 90, 1990. 3 sistemas biológicos, as terras cultiváveis, as florestas e os campos, sustentam a economia mundial. Lester Brown, que vai mais longe, dizendo: são as mudanças nas dimensões do produto fotossintético, ou seja, das plantas, da biomassa, que determinam, em última instância, quantos de nós a Terra pode sustentar. E Lester Brown diz mais ainda: o processo de fotossíntese, que é comum a todos esses sistemas biológicos, é a capacidade que os vegetais possuem de fazer uso da energia solar, graças à qual combina água e dióxido de carbono de modo a produzir biomassa, carboidrato. Eu acho que, com isto, a equação energética e ambiental do planeta está equacionada do ponto de vista da ciência. Se há outros ingredientes, eu não tenho motivação para analisá-los, porque isto aqui é física rigorosa, é a natureza como ela é. Bom, nesse contexto, na sua própria análise, nós temos a grande fonte de energia, que é o Sol, que é o reator à fusão nuclear, que dificilmente o homem conseguirá administrá-lo, mas que existe e que tem sua influência maior nos trópicos. E se nós adicionamos que o Brasil tem 22% da água do planeta e um continente vazio, qual é a influência e a responsabilidade que o povo brasileiro e a classe dirigente brasileira tem a ver com esta eventual catástrofe sobre a economia mundial, sobre a vida e sobre tudo que representa as civilizações e o que vale a pena viver por isso?
Brazil, with its huge landmass, has an abundance of solar energy. There's a lot of sunlight in Brazil. This can be converted into energy, into biochemical energy that we and all other living things can use through photosynthesis. That photosynthetic process can also produce energy in the form of alcohol fuels, sugarcane and alcohol fuels. That same solar energy can also be used for solar cells to generate electricity, and that same solar energy generates wind differentials, temperature differentials that produce wind. So in terms of energy endowment, Brazil is richly endowed with energy, with renewable energy. As long as the sun, that fusion reactor, as you called it, is there, Brazil will be rich in energy. The question is how to capture that energy and how to move away from fossil fuels, which are disrupting the Earth's climate system and producing air pollution, as here in Sao Paulo, and move toward the renewable energy resources. This is a challenge for Brazil and for the world. The exciting thing now is that we can see the technologies. I mentioned wind power, for example. There are many farmers in the United States, most recently in the state of Iowa, where the local utility has opened wind farms, has begun building wind farms on the corn land. Farmers still produce the land, still use the land to produce corn, but at the same time, they have the wind turbines to produce electricity. So they're selling corn and electricity from the same land. In Altamont Pass, east of San Francisco, farmers run cattle on land. They have been for a long time. They now also have wind turbines on that land. They sell both beef and electricity. So this is becoming a new model, and those who own land, particularly farmers, will be able to produce sell both energy and crops or livestock products. So we're looking at a new energy model. In the United States, in the state of Texas, there is a large natural gas company called Enron. They have now become a global energy company, but they have natural gas fields, and they have pipelines running up to the northeastern United States into the Midwest, and they supply natural gas. But they have bought 2 wind companies in the last few years, and they plan one day to use electricity from wind to electrolyze water and produce hydrogen, and use their natural gas storage and distribution infrastructure for hydrogen. And they see themselves as being part of the transition from the fossil fuel-based economy to the solar/hydrogen-based economy of the future. So already in industry, we're beginning to see the more forward-looking chief executive officers beginning to restructure their economies and invest in the new energy sources.
Mas o hidrogênio não existe na natureza, portanto, ele não é uma fonte de energia. Por que excluir a forma mais prática, mais direta da biomassa dos trópicos? Porque essas soluções podem ser úteis para os Estados Unidos, que não têm energia solar em grande quantidade, nem tem água, nem tem território. Então, a solução tropical pode ser uma solução muito mais vantajosa, inclusive para os Estados Unidos, tendo em vista que é uma fonte absolutamente direta de energia e, do ponto de vista da física, absolutamente não competitiva em termos da natureza.
First of all, we have to be careful not to destroy the natural biological systems, but second of all, the efficiency of conversion of solar energy into usable energy is less with photosynthesis, much less than it is with solar cells or with wind power. The interesting thing about wind power is you can still have the grass, you can still have the crops. You harvest the wind from up on high, and so you capture both sources of energy. That's the most efficient system of all, and that, I think, should be our goal.
Ok, estamos de volta com Roda Viva esta noite entrevistando Lester Brown, o presidente do World Watch Institute. É uma organização não governamental sediada em Washington, tem várias publicações, tem um site na internet no Brasil que é www.worldwatch.org.br. Também é um telefone pelo qual é possível entrar em contato, está aí no vídeo, 070, código da operadora 71-315-1458. E tem essas publicações aqui, esta revista bimestral, já está no volume 12 aqui, e nesta aqui, O Estado do Mundo, que é a mais recente edição, 1999, que apresenta aí uma avaliação da situação do relatório do World Watch sobre a sociedade em que nós vivemos, a situação ambiental. Eu queria aproveitar aqui a prerrogativa do entrevistador para começar com uma questão que eu sei que vai acabar ficando para escanteio, porque as pessoas aqui, cada um tem seu interesse específico e nunca ninguém fica satisfeito com as explicações do nosso entrevistado. Isso é uma regra num programa de 1h30, natural. E a minha questão é a seguinte. A avaliação que vocês fazem das mudanças necessárias, né, na economia e na política tem um peso muito grande calcado nas organizações não governamentais. O relatório apresenta vários dados sobre o crescimento dessas organizações, o chamado terceiro setor, que aqui no Brasil também cresce. Mas eu volto a insistir, a sensação, e na primeira pergunta o senhor falou da importância do papel dos governos nisso. A sensação que se tem quando se fala muito em organizações não governamentais e terceiro setor como sendo a saída para grandes mudanças na nossa sociedade é de que isso depende menos do governo. Pelo que eu entendi da sua primeira resposta, embora existam organizações não governamentais e o crescimento dessas organizações, vocês não estão pregando aí o fim do papel dos governos nessas mudanças maiores da economia e do meio ambiente.
Governments have a central role to play, and the more complex the world becomes, the more demanding their role is. NGOs have evolved to fill the gaps left by governments in various countries around the world. And the growth of the NGO sector, the non-governmental organization sector, is one of the interesting social phenomena of the last half century. I mean, it is interesting that today we are talking about the State of the World report, which is an environmental State of the World report. It should be produced by the United Nations, but the United Nations does not produce an annual environmental report. It does for State of Food and Agriculture from FAO. It does State of the World's Health from the World Health Organization. But because the UN does not produce an annual environmental report, then an NGO, in this case the World Watch Institute, has stepped in to fill this need. It's interesting that the State of the World report that we do, though it's produced by an NGO, is now seen as being sort of semi-official. Governments all over the world use it. UN agencies use it. Environmental groups use it. Professors use it in colleges and universities. In the United States, more than 1,000 college and university courses use State of the World as a textbook. So I use this simply to illustrate that NGOs are trying to fill the gaps that governments or international, that governments or the United Nations are not filling. And I think it's an interesting development. It does not mean that government is no longer important, because one of the responsibilities or one of the roles of NGOs is to influence governments. And at the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle that will be coming up shortly, for example, we will see that NGOs will play a major role in influencing the governments who are gathered there to negotiate further liberalization of trade. And one of the important groups there will be environmental groups who want to make sure that trade advances in trade are not environmentally destructive. So the NGO phenomenon is an interesting social and political phenomenon. It represents a third sector, and it's much more developed in some countries than in others. In Japan, for example, there was traditionally the government and business, and that was pretty much it. There was no independent sector, no third sector. NGOs didn't exist. Now that third sector is beginning to develop. In Brazil, there is a reasonably well-developed third sectors. There are many environmental groups, many groups working on social issues of all kinds. So the evolution of the NGO community in the world is an important social development. I think historians will recognize its importance when they write the history of the last half of the 20th century.
Walter.
Dr. Brown, na década de 80, eu gostaria de voltar ao tema da energia renovável. Na década de 80, o senhor lançou um livro que fez muito sucesso no Brasil, cujo nome era Construindo uma Sociedade Viável. E o que me impressionou bastante na época era a defesa que o senhor fazia do Programa Nacional do Álcool, Programa Brasileiro de Produção de Álcool. E o curioso nessa observação do senhor é que o senhor tomava os planos do governo da década de 70 como planos que estavam se realizando. E o governo brasileiro, naquela época, previa a produção de álcool de várias fontes alternativas de energia, não apenas da cana-de-açúcar, como do babaçu, no norte, da mandioca, no centro do país. Se propunha também a utilização de produção de álcool em microdestilarias, produção de óleos vegetais que iriam substituir óleo diesel, uma série de outras energias, fontes de energia renovável. Bom, passado 25 anos desse lançamento do pró-álcool, o que a gente percebe é que hoje se volta a falar novamente numa retomada desse programa, em função da elevação do preço do petróleo, em termos internacionais, da própria escassez de outras fontes de energia. E o que se observa é que, nesses 25 anos, o modelo de produção do álcool no Brasil caminhou para o lado contrário daquilo que o senhor previa. Se produz hoje álcool em grandes propriedades, de forma extensiva, com utilização pesada de agrotóxicos, mecanização, queima da cana no corte. Então, que avaliação que o senhor faz desses programas? Como é que o senhor vê uma retomada desse programa no Brasil daqui para frente?
There are two things to think about in answering your question. One is using resources that can produce food to produce fuel. If the projected growth in world population of another 3 billion people by 2050 materializes, that's almost as many as we've added in the last half century, we're probably going to need all the agricultural resources just to produce food. I noticed, for example, that while Brazil is producing much more alcohol, most of it from sugarcane, which happens to be the most efficient way to produce alcohol from crops, that Brazil is also the largest grain importer in the Western Hemisphere. So over the longer term, we're going to have to choose between using agricultural land and resources to produce food or to produce fuel. We may not have enough to produce as much fuel. Since that book that you referred to, Building a Sustainable Society, we've seen enormous advances in technology, in solar cells and in wind energy, which have greatly reduced the cost and the efficiency of energy production from those sources. As we look ahead, we see the solar/hydrogen economy evolving based more on wind power and solar cells than on biomass. There will be some places in the world where it will probably make sense to convert biomass into fuel. Wood, after all, was the earliest fuel and was an important part of human evolution beginning 500,000 or more years ago. It was the first sort of organized way of producing energy. But over the long term, we're going to have to devise we're going to have to turn to the most efficient ways of converting sunlight into usable energy. And it now looks as though that's going to be wind power and solar cells. One of the exciting new technologies is one developed in Japan, where they have developed a solar roofing material. That is, the roofing material, the roof of the house of the building becomes the power plant for the building, and it produces electricity. This is exciting because we have to put roofs on buildings anyhow, and if you can put a roof on a building that produces electricity as well as providing the shelter, then that's an added advantage. So this technology is beginning to spread rapidly in Japan, in a number of third world countries, and also in Germany, in Europe, where they're making a major push. The other thing we have to think about is how quickly we can build the hydrogen-based economy and shift from the carbon-based economy we now have. The exciting thing here, and this is one of the things we talk about in State of the World, is that a group of corporations has approached the government of Iceland about making it the world's first hydrogen-powered economy. Now, that's interesting because the two corporations that head this consortium that are leading it are Shell Oil and Daimler Chrysler, used to be Daimler-Benz. Mm-hmm. Shell Oil is interested because there's a lot of cheap hydropower in Iceland, and they can use that to electrolyze water and produce hydrogen. That hydrogen can then be used as a fuel for transportation, for example, either in a traditional internal combustion engine, burning the hydrogen as we burn gasoline, or what is much more efficient, using fuel cells. Daimler Chrysler is a leader in the development of automobiles powered by fuel cell engines, which are very different from the traditional internal combustion engines. So Daimler Chrysler sees this as a country in which they can first introduce their fuel cell engines using hydrogen as a fuel. So we're beginning to see some sort of corporate leapfrogging into the future, in some cases getting beyond governments. It wasn't the government of Iceland that had this idea. It was some corporations that had the idea. They went to the government and said, we'd like to make Iceland the world's first hydrogen-powered economy. And they're already beginning to move in that direction. So over the longer term, the global energy system based on renewable energy systems will be dominated by those energy sources that come from the sun, that produce energy most efficiently.
Bom, a gente está falando muito da questão da energia e da questão do consumo. Eu gostaria de introduzir dois novos elementos aqui nessa discussão. Porque o senhor disse que não que a forma como se produz, qual é o recurso que a gente está utilizando para produzir energia é mais importante do que o quanto que está sendo consumido. Mas eu gostaria de colocar a questão da população. A gente, em 2050, a população da Índia, por exemplo, deve ultrapassar a população da China. A gente tem, a água é um recurso finito no planeta. Então, quer dizer, não dá, por exemplo, para toda a população da China ou para toda a população da Índia consumir como consomem os norte-americanos. Por exemplo, cada duas pessoas na Índia ter um automóvel. Eu gostaria que o senhor apontasse caminhos nesse sentido. Como ter um desenvolvimento sustentável, que é o que mais se fala hoje, que é esse conceito que ninguém sabe direito o que é. Quais são os caminhos para se chegar a isso, considerando, por exemplo, essas duas novas variáveis, a questão da população, crescimento populacional e a questão da escassez da água?
Thank you for that question. Let me talk both about the transportation system, because you mentioned cars. It's true that India will never have a car in every garage, and China won't have a car in every garage. There's not enough land to accommodate the automobile as a system, as the centerpiece of the transportation system. There's, interestingly, within China, a group of scientists, very prominent scientists, has challenged the government's idea of encouraging the manufacture of automobiles in China. And the principal reason for their challenge is they say we do not have enough land in China to produce, for everyone to have a car. We don't have enough land for the roads, the highways, the parking lots, and to feed our people, so we have to make a choice. The basic point underlying this part of your question is that we have to redesign the transportation system. The automobile was a very attractive mode of transportation for much of this century because it provided mobility at a time when the world was largely rural. But as the world has become increasingly urban, as it is today, we discover that there's an inherent conflict between the automobile and the city. And the automobile cannot provide the mobility that it promises in an urban environment. If you live in Sao Paulo, I don't have to tell you about traffic congestion. It has reached the point now where many governments, city governments and national governments, are beginning to question whether or not the automobile can be the center of urban transportation systems. For example, in London today, the speed of the average car moving about the city is almost exactly the same as that of a horse-drawn carriage a century ago, despite the enormous investment. Not because the automobiles can't go faster, because there's so much congestion that they can't move fast. In Bangkok, Thailand last year, to take a developing country, the average motorist spent the equivalent of 44 working days sitting in his car, going nowhere. It's not working, so we have to rethink the system. And what we're beginning to see is the evolution of a new urban transportation model centered around light rail, including undergrounds or metro systems, and the bicycle. In the United States, we now have an interesting development that has occurred in some 300 cities with the police forces. The policemen have discovered in cities that when they're called to an accident site or an emergency of some kind, they can't get there quickly. You know, they turn on their sirens and they blink their lights, but it's just very difficult to move through heavy traffic congestion. So what they've done is they've started putting police officers on bicycles. And what they've discovered is that an officer on a bicycle can respond to 50% more calls in a working day than a colleague in a squad car. When I go running in the evening after work, I go for a 4-mile run sometimes, and I run past the vice president's home on Massachusetts Avenue. The Secret Service agents that patrol that do it on bicycles, not on cars. Even at the White House, Secret Service are on bicycles. But what the police departments and the city governments have discovered in 300 cities in the United States is that the bicycle works much better than the squad car in many situations. Not only are the officers more productive, they're closer to the people, and the costs of maintaining a bicycle are much less than the costs of maintaining an automobile. So we're beginning to see a shift in thinking about what urban transportation systems should look like, and they're not centered around the automobile anymore. If you want mobility in cities, the automobile cannot provide it. That's the basic conclusion. So we're now seeing a basic redesign of urban transport systems. Curitiba is an example here in Brazil that the entire world looks to, which has really redesigned the urban transportation system to diminish the role of the automobile and therefore the traffic congestion. On your other question of population growth, let me just mention one other point. If China were ever to achieve, a car in every garage, or maybe 2 cars in every garage, American style, they would need to consume 80 million barrels of oil a day. The world currently produces only 72 million barrels. It's not possible. It's not going to happen. We have to rethink the question. The question is not how many people can own automobiles, but how do we provide the maximum amount of mobility? And what the Chinese scientists have recommended is a high-tech rail system augmented by the bicycle. Now, coming to your water question, at the World Watch Institute, we think that water scarcity is the most underestimated resource issue that the world faces. It's in many ways an invisible problem. 20 years ago, the world began to worry about what was happening to tropical rainforests. But you could see tropical rainforests being cut. You could see them being burned. You could see it on the evening TV news. But falling water tables are not visible. You discover that the aquifer is depleted when the well goes dry. And that's what's happening in many parts of the world today. The International Water Management Institute estimates that in India, the amount of water pumped from underground is now double the rate of aquifer recharge from rainfall. So water tables are falling almost everywhere in India. And at some point, this could lead to major cutbacks in water supplies. The failure to think about future population growth and water supplies, I think, is going to compromise the ability of governments to provide the lifestyles that people have wanted.
Não é o caso de se mudar o padrão de consumo, porque na consideração que o senhor fez em relação à questão da energia, eu acho que a questão básica, acho que todo mundo praticamente que está aqui concorda que foi essa discussão do intervalo, é que preciso mudar o padrão de consumo. Os americanos, norte-americanos, não podem continuar consumindo o quanto eles produzem, independente se eles tiverem uma energia renovável sendo utilizada.
The basic point I wanted to make on energy, looking at energy alone, is that the key point is not so much how much energy we use, but how we produce it. But when we look at the overall lifestyle, if we want mobility, if mobility is a social goal, and in most societies it is, then we have to ask, how do we provide mobility, the most mobility? And it's not with the automobile. So in answering that question, we begin to diminish the consumption level, because if we want mobility, if we want policemen who are mobility in American cities, it's on bicycles, not on cars. So in satisfying the desire for mobility, there is built in a very substantial reduction in consumption. We also have a situation in the United States where we have an imbalance between the amount of calories that we consume and the amount of calories that we use as individuals. So more and more people are overweight. So people drive to fitness centers where they sit on a stationary bicycle for half an hour, working up a sweat, using calories, and they take a shower, get in their car, and drive home again. The reason they do that is because they don't feel comfortable riding a bicycle to work. We don't have a bicycle-friendly transportation system. The transportation system has been designed for the automobile. We have to begin changing that. And when we do change it, not only will the air be cleaner, will the climate disruption be less, but we will be healthier also. So we'll be gaining. It'll be a win-win-win situation. And most people, if you were to ask them these questions, they would agree that the automobile is not working. But we need to redesign the system. The automobile is not working in cities, so we need to redesign the system so we can provide the mobility that people want, but without without disrupting the climate system and without all the air pollution that we now have.
Marcelo.
Sr. Brown, eu gostaria de entender um pouco melhor qual é o papel que o senhor atribui à tecnologia na questão da sustentabilidade. Quando o senhor diz, e repetiu mais de uma vez aqui, que o problema não é tanto o quanto se produz, mas o como se produz, eu posso entender isso, eu acho que muitas pessoas entenderão que o senhor é adepto da ideia de que existe ou pode ser criada uma solução tecnológica para qualquer problema. E certamente isso é uma coisa bastante discutida hoje em dia, é discutível. Uma razão é que, como o senhor mesmo disse, os recursos, pelo menos alguns deles, são finitos para efeitos práticos. Então, a tecnologia talvez não tenha solução para tudo, como no caso da terra para acomodar todos os carros de todos os chineses. Mas também porque as tecnologias têm que ser socialmente aceitáveis. Eu queria lhe dar o exemplo da engenharia genética. Os defensores dos alimentos transgênicos dizem que eles são imprescindíveis, porque sem eles o mundo não vai ser capaz de alimentar a população de 9 bilhões de pessoas em 2050 ou quando for. Mas certamente há muita gente que discorda disso, especialmente na Europa, por motivos de outra ordem, éticos, científicos, ambientais, os que forem. Não é o caso dos Estados Unidos, onde o público, pelo menos até o presente, não manifestou uma reação mais forte a isso. Eu queria saber primeiro se o senhor concorda com essa ideia de que existem soluções tecnológicas para quaisquer problemas na área da sustentabilidade, e segundo, se a engenharia genética figura entre essas tecnologias salvacionistas.
First, let me make it clear, I'm not advocating the idea that there's a technological solution for every problem. I do think advancing technology can play an important role. I would cite the evolution of technologies in wind electric generation, which 50 years ago were very simple and crude compared with the designs of wind turbines today that are based on the latest aerospace design and so forth. So the technology can help solve many of our problems, but it will not solve all of our problems by any means, and it is not the solution to all our problems. In many cases, it's a matter of redesigning the system. With transportations, for example, I mean, we talk about the bicycles being the transport vehicle of the future. Most people don't know that world bicycle production today is 3 times automobile production, for example. There are some technologies that we have tried that people thought would work, which didn't. An example would be the supersonic transport. I can remember articles in The Economist back in the late 60s that made it sound as though whether the Europeans or the Americans won the race in producing the supersonic transport would determine the future of economic history. You know, it would be such a decisive advantage. In fact, there has never been a supersonic transport sold commercially. Only government airlines have bought them, and they've been heavily subsidized. It's a dead-end technology. Mm-hmm. Nuclear power would be another technology where we would argue you don't even have to get past the economics before you can see it's now no longer a competitive source of electricity. On the specific question of genetically modified organisms, this is a difficult and complex question for me as an analyst to answer. There are some situations where, first, I would say that the potential for raising world production, some of the advertisements from the companies that are involved in biotechnology say it's a way of doubling world food production to satisfy future growth and demand and so forth. I don't think it is. And I say that because scientists using traditional breeding techniques have done most of the things that they can think of to increase cropland productivity. And we're pushing up against various physiological limits now, including photosynthetic efficiency, other metabolic processes in plants. So then the question becomes more, can we use genetic engineering to reduce the use of insecticides, for example? And then if we have a choice between using insecticides, where we know at least some of the risks associated with that, or using a crop variety that's genetically encoded with information to defend itself, which is the wiser technology to use, which is the less disruptive environmentally. And as an analyst, I do not know the answer to that question. In part because we know a bit more about the effect of insecticides on the environment, on human health, et cetera, than we do about the environmental consequences, including the health consequences of genetically modified crops. So it's a complex issue, and as the head of a research institute, I have to answer with my head, not with my emotions and feelings. It's complex, and in some cases, genetically modified organisms are leading to an increase in the use of herbicides, for example. Soybeans would be a good example of that, where the soybeans are modified to resist the effect of herbicides or weed killers so that weed killers can be used on soybeans, on the new varieties, in a way they couldn't be on the older varieties. So it's a complex set of issues, and it reminds me of a book that came out some years back entitled The Decline of Complex Societies, in which the author sort of theorized that when societies reach the point where the technologies that they develop exceed the capacity of their political institutions to manage them, they very often decline. It's an interesting sort of thesis to think about, but I have the feeling that with many of our current technologies, our understanding of their consequences is grossly inadequate. And that's true, I think, for the use of insecticides. It's also true for the use of genetically modified crops.
Dr. Brown, eu tenho percebido que o ser humano tem passado, desde a sua origem, de uma coisa que a gente pode chamar de biodiversidade solidária para algo que seria uma sociodiversidade belicosa. E a gente pode perceber isso se considerarmos que em 42 mil anos a população chegou a 1 bilhão de habitantes. E nos 200 anos ela passou para 6 bilhões de habitantes. O que eu gostaria de saber, citando um psiquiatra que eu entrevistei há alguns anos, o Dr. Richard Kanner, ele me dizia que é uma visão pessimista da humanidade. Ele dizia que o ser humano é o câncer da Terra, porque onde ele se instala, a rapidez com que ele transforma o meio ambiente é tamanha que, aparentemente, isso passa a ser uma situação incontrolável. Eu teria duas questões para o senhor. Primeiro, se essa visão pessimista parece que está se realizando, se concretizando até hoje no mundo. E se poderíamos considerar que nessa dimensão o ecossistema urbano seria hoje aquele mais ameaçado em todo o planeta.
The question that you posed, the broader question about, in quoting a scientist who said that our species is like a cancer on the environment, it's a profound question. Last month I was in Innsbruck, Austria, for a conference of business types. And one of the speakers was the head of a research institute in Switzerland. It was a public policy research institute. And he said to me as we were sitting on the front row, he's sitting next to me as a speaker that came, I think, right after, he said to me, technology is nature's experiment with man. Technology is nature's experiment with man. And he sort of turned things around. We always look at nature starting with ourselves. He was looking at us starting with nature. And one has to wonder about this. We are clearly, in contrast to earlier civilizations that got on an economic path that was environmentally unsustainable, we're a global civilization. They were local civilizations. Okay. What happened in Mesopotamia or with the Mayans affected only that area. It did not affect the rest of the world. Today we know that we're part of an integrated global economy. We know that we are altering the Earth's ecosystem. We're altering the Earth's climate, not just the climate over the United States or over Brazil. And we're doing it in ways that we do not fully understand. I mean, I'd like to, if there's an opportunity, to talk more about global warming and some of the evidence of that and what it might mean. It's a great experiment that we're conducting without having the slightest idea of what all the consequences are. So the idea that one could see our species as a cancer on the global environment is not unreasonable. We are clearly in a situation now, I think, where if we do not make adjustments quickly in the relationship between ourselves, now numbering 6 billion, and the natural systems and resources on which we depend, whether it's the biodiversity of life or water resources or the climate system, that we're going to see those natural systems undermine the economy, just as they did in many ancient civilizations. This is the big challenge for us, to see if we can make the economic course corrections that will protect the environmental support systems on which we all depend.
E a questão urbana?
E a questão urbana, a questão da ameaça...
Se os meios urbanos são, os sistemas urbanos são efetivamente os mais ameaçados.
Cities are not natural. They require concentrations of energy, water, food, materials that we have to assemble. We bring food sometimes from halfway around the world, materials from other places. Even water can now come from hundreds of miles away. Beijing is now working on a water system that will bring water from the Yangtze rivers 900 miles away. California gets water from Colorado that's transported hundreds of miles for use in Los Angeles, for example. So not only do we concentrate enormous amounts of energy, food, water, and materials, but then we have to redisseminate those. We can't permit the pollutants to keep building in the cities, or the cities become uninhabitable. So we dump the waste in rivers, or we discharge it into the air in an effort to get rid of it to prevent the buildup. But the basic point is that someone living in a city requires much more in the way of resources. Energy, for example, to transport the water or the food or what have you, than someone who's living on the land and much closer to nature. It is quite possible, as we look ahead, and if we face food scarcity, that we'll see a traditional shift. Because historically, ever since the Industrial Revolution began, those living in cities have had the economic advantage because they controlled technology and they controlled capital. But if in the future the scarce resources become land and water, then those who control the land and water, that is the agricultural population instead of the urban population, will have the upper hand. It is conceivable that the terms of trade, which have historically favored the city, will begin again to favor the countryside. That could actually reverse the process of urbanization. Now, we don't think about that. We sort of assume that the rapid urbanization of this century will continue into the next century. It may not, for reasons that are implied in the question that you just asked.
Eu começaria, então, abordando a questão que é muito presente nesse trabalho sobre o estado do mundo, que é do aquecimento global. Não há dúvida, pergunto bem objetivamente, de que realmente a temperatura do mundo está aquecendo ou simplesmente o tempo enlouqueceu?
A lot of people ask the question, has the climate gone crazy? Because we seem to have more extremes. And one of the characteristics of a rise in temperature worldwide often is more extremes. One of the things we do in State of the World is that we add the average global temperature to a chart that we have that begins in 1866 and comes up to the present. When we went to add the data for 1998, it literally went off the top of the chart. We had to recalibrate the vertical axis and extend it in order to get the data on it. And it had a number of consequences. One, it led to more destructive storms, because the more energy in the system, particularly the higher the temperature of tropical and subtropical waters, the more energy radiating into the atmosphere to drive storm systems. So we had in 1998 some of the most destructive storms, some of the worst flooding on record. In 1998, 300 million people were driven from their homes by weather-related events, storms, floods, etc. Half of them in the Yangtze River Basin in China, which had some of the worst flooding in history. As temperature goes up, it increases snowmelt in the Himalayas, for example. So the rivers running, the Yangtze was higher. It increases evaporation. The higher the temperature, the more evaporation, the more water goes up, the more comes down. So we had an unbelievable dislocation of people. But probably the most disturbing trend that I see in looking at the climate now, aside from the fact that the 15 warmest years in the last century have all come since 1980, so there's a very distinct upward trend in the temperature chart. The thing that disturbs me most is the amount of ice melting we're now beginning to see. We're seeing parts of the Antarctic ice cap begin to break up at an unprecedented rate just in the last year or two. We're seeing melting in Antarctica and Alaska. I was in Austria recently, was talking to them about the Iceman who was discovered in the Austrian Italian Alps right on the border between the two countries. I think it was 7 years ago. Some hikers discovered a male body protruding from the glacier because the ice was melting and someone who'd been there for 5,000 years was now becoming visible. In Canada's western Yukon territories up near Alaska, just in the last few months, another male was discovered protruding from a glacier because the melting had left them. Our ancestors are literally emerging from the ice as the ice melts, and they have a message for us. And the message is the answer to your question. It is the Earth is getting warmer. And as more ice melts, then we'll begin to see sea level rise. And low-lying coastal regions and cities around the world will be threatened by that. And at a time when population is still growing, the habitable land area will begin to shrink. And this is one of the great risks of climate change. It's rising sea level.
Dr. Brown, com relação a essa questão do consumo, do aquecimento global, nós devemos, eu acredito, considerar que há um modelo de consumo, um modelo de produção que costuma ser e que precisaria, eventualmente, ser questionado. Nós produzimos para a cidade, principalmente produzimos para atender a uma determinada demanda que tende a ser, inclusive, simbólica. A minha pergunta não seria o caso de nós mudarmos a maneira de informar a essas pessoas que estão consumindo e, mais do que isso, mudar um pouco as relações entre a remuneração do capital e a remuneração do trabalho para que uma sociedade pudesse caminhar numa direção melhor?
In looking at government policy changes, I would put at the top restructuring the tax system to reduce income taxes and increase taxes on environmentally destructive activities. The second priority I would give to what we call eco-labeling, letting consumers know if they buy a wood product, furniture for example, that they will know whether that wood came from a forest that is being managed sustainably or whether it was just clear-cut with little regard for the environment. Let consumers speak with their pocketbooks. Consumers can speak with their votes now when they, at the ballot box, when they choose their leaders. But they can also vote with their pocketbooks. One of the most successful initiatives we've seen in the United States in the last few years is one where utility companies that supply electricity offer their consumers, their customers, an option between energy produced from fossil fuels like coal, for example, or energy produced from renewable sources like wind or solar cells. And sometimes this involves an increase in cost, and the consumer will have to be willing to pay 20% more to get electricity from wind or from solar cells than from the traditional fossil fuel sources. But at least they have the option. And what this is doing is that many people are opting for what is now the more costly source, but it's renewable. Now, over time, that cost is going to go down. But now we find utilities suddenly investing in wind farms, for example, in order to be able to satisfy that demand. So the idea of informing consumers about the environmental effects of the various things they buy, the efficiency of an automobile engine, for example, in terms of kilometers per liter or what have you. I think this is an essential step in creating an environmentally sustainable future, because we change our behavior either in response to new information or new experiences. And in many cases, new information will bring about some of the changes that we need.
O senhor acha que seria necessária uma nova moral mundial para discutir isso? E que isso pudesse ser mais amplamente apresentado para a sociedade, essa nova moral, para diminuir essa intensidade desse consumo?
One of the things we need to ask is what is important to us. And what all the great religions tell us, teach us, is that consuming does not lead to happiness. In fact, too much consumption can lead to unhappiness. We become so preoccupied with material possessions, we lose sight of the things that are really important. In my own case, I mean, I find living a simple life. I have a bicycle, a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Washington. If someone were to give me a car, I would not accept it. It's too much of a nuisance, trying to find a place to park it, and getting it repaired, and getting it insured and inspected. It's just much simpler to use a bicycle or to walk to get around in Washington, D.C. I cite that as an example. Now, I once had an automobile, 25 years ago. But I see switching from an automobile to a bicycle as an improvement in the quality of my life. A very dramatic improvement, in fact, but also it lowers consumption of resources. And I think when more and more people are faced with the option, they'll begin to realize that consuming more is not necessarily the way to a better life.
Marcelo.
Eu queria aproveitar essa deixa aí do papel da vida pessoal na militância, vamos dizer assim, ambiental. Eu queria saber se o senhor concorda com a proposta feita por Bill McKibben de que as pessoas, especialmente nos países ricos, deveriam ter apenas um filho.
I happen to be a close friend of Bill McKibben, so I am familiar with his writing, and the idea of a one-child family in the United States is a very interesting one. His basic point, and it's one that I also have made many times, he's actually written a book about it, is that the most important environmental decision that an American will ever make is how many children to have, because of the very high consumption levels. And he argues that at least for a while we ought to try, in effect, to do what the Chinese have tried to do, which is to limit family size to one until we can stabilize consumption and stabilize the relationship between ourselves and the environment. In thinking about population growth, my sense is that for many societies, and it comes back to the water question earlier, many societies are foregoing future options for improving the quality of life because the populations are outgrowing the water supply. We assume, for example, in our societies, in Brazil and the US, that one day everyone will have indoor plumbing and be able to take a shower. But in China and India, that's not going to be an option. There's simply not enough water for everyone to take a daily shower. And they're beginning to discover that. And this is one reason why the Chinese decided many years ago to try and quickly slow population growth, because they saw their population outrunning their supplies of basic resources.
Yeah.
Eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta um pouco filosófica. Eu gostaria de saber se o senhor acha que parte da solução para os problemas do planeta não estaria no homem se sentir novamente parte da natureza.
This is a basic philosophical question. It's a basic philosophical point. We have, because of advancing technology and urbanization, we have sort of separated ourselves from nature, and we think of ourselves as existing independently of nature. but we are as dependent on nature as were our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We cannot exist without the Earth's natural systems. And we're going to be in fact, we are in serious trouble because we've sort of forgotten how dependent we are on those systems and how important it is to protect those systems.
Volta.
Our future survival depends on seeing ourselves not as a part from nature, but as a part of nature.
Dr. Brown, todo ano as Nações Unidas, o Departamento Econômico das Nações Unidas, prepara um panorama da economia mundial. Nesse ano, o tema do panorama da economia mundial foi a concessão de microcrédito. São créditos de $100, $200 para pequenos empresários, pessoas da sociedade que precisam começar um negócio. No Brasil, nós também estamos iniciando algumas experiências com microcrédito. Existem algumas experiências de Banco do Povo, como se chama aqui no Brasil. E o balanço que se pode fazer é que, quando esse Banco do Povo é patrocinado por organismos financeiros oficiais, não tem funcionado. No entanto, quando a sociedade se reúne, quando as organizações não governamentais se organizam e conseguem obter recursos, o crédito funciona com uma facilidade enorme. O senhor vê que isso daí como uma saída, como uma ação que faz diferença na construção de uma sociedade sustentável?
Most of the world's existing financial institutions are accustomed to making big loans, especially at the international development level. And the idea of someone at the World Bank making a $100 loan instead of a $100 million loan just doesn't make any sense. And I think they're right in that sense. And it means that we need local institutions, in most cases NGOs, as you've described. I mean, the success story that's always cited, and it was the source of the idea of micro-lending, of making $50 or $100 loans to local people in rural villages, originated in Bangladesh with the Grameen Bank. And it was an NGO. It wasn't a government-sponsored, it wasn't a World Bank-sponsored approach, and it's been highly successful. So these things tend to work better when they evolve locally and involve local people and are outside government and outside the major international financial institutions. Now, it's conceivable that the World Bank could provide seed capital to an NGO that was organizing to do this. So I wouldn't rule out their participation, but the administration works much better if it's local and if it's outside official government channels.
Na questão tecnológica, eu gostaria de fazer um comentário, porque há uma certa ideia que tudo é resolvido pela tecnologia. E a tecnologia é um meio. Se a tecnologia não se aplica sobre um bem natural, ele não vale nada. Acabou o petróleo, não adianta a tecnologia do petróleo. Quer dizer, se nós não temos substituto para o petróleo, não é tendo tecnologia que nós vamos aplicar cuspe para resolver a questão energética mundial. A questão da biomassa e do petróleo é muito claro. Ambos têm a mesma origem, que é a energia do Sol. Só que o petróleo leva 800 milhões de anos e o Sol pode produzir em 3 meses com óleo de girassol energia melhor que o óleo diesel do petróleo. Então, essa questão, primeiro, é que a tecnologia não é a solução. Então, dentro desse contexto, era importante ouvi-lo nas questões de fundo. Por que um país como o Brasil, que já produz alimentos para 800 milhões de pessoas, com apenas 13% do seu território, tem metade da população passando fome? A pergunta, por quê? Se já produz alimento para 800 milhões de habitantes, com apenas 13% do seu território. De uma certa maneira, a resposta foi dada pelo senhor mesmo no documento do World Watch, quando o senhor disse: os indicadores econômicos são falhos num aspecto fundamental. Não fazem distinção entre o uso de recursos que sustentam o progresso e o desenvolvimento e os recursos que minam o progresso e a vida. A resposta está aqui. Esse sistema da tirania financeira, do dinheiro falso, está destruindo o Brasil. Quer dizer, nós estamos com uma das mais baixas rendas per capita do mundo, se considerarmos o produto nacional bruto, não o produto interno que vai em grande parte para fora. Então, eu gostaria de seus comentários sobre essas razões de fundo que são a causa destes destemperos e destas esquizofrenias de ignorar a base da natureza e da vida. E o segundo, eu gostaria de ouvi-lo sobre a ideia do E8, do Environment 8. Qual é a ideia da concepção do E8 ante o G7?
Right. There are 2 or 3 questions here. One is about technology. Technology is not a solution to all problems. One of the problems it's not a solution to, obviously, is income distribution. We will be publishing in the new State of the World report data on the share of the world's population that is overweight, overnourished and overweight, and the share that's undernourished and underweight. For the first time in history, the number of people in the world who are overweight rivals the number of people who are underweight. This is evidence of the maldistribution of resources in the world. Brazil, it's true, has one of the worst income distribution patterns of any country. Technology will not solve that problem. That's a political challenge, and there's no substitute for it. On the question of the E8, what we did in State of the World in the first chapter a couple of years ago was to look at the G7 economic group that was formed some 20 years ago when we had international instability in the monetary system. And this G7 group was to represent the leading economies in the world who would get together once a year to review developments and see what needed to be done on the economic front. But in many ways, the big problems facing the world today are not economic. I mean, there are economic problems, but the real challenges are environmental. Stabilizing climate, stabilizing population, protecting the Earth's biological diversity. I could go down the list, which everyone knows. But there is no comparable group. So we looked at the world, and we looked at consumption and production. We looked at land area. We looked at plant and animal species, biological diversity, and a series of things, and identified 8 countries that account for more than half of carbon emissions. They have more than half of the world's biological diversity. Brazil is one of those 8 countries. Brazil is not a member of the group of the G7 group, but it is a member of the E8 group. The other members in Asia are China, India, Indonesia, and Japan. And in Europe, it's Russia and Germany, the United Germany. And in the Western Hemisphere, it's Brazil and the United States. These 8 countries, we think, should be getting together periodically to look at the environmental indicators, see how they're progressing, whether things are moving the right direction, if not, what needs to be done. Because these 8 countries have the capacity to make decisions that will affect the future of the world, just as the G7 can make economic decisions. So we thought it was an important distinction to make.
Dr. Brown, o senhor, todos nós sabemos que um dos maiores problemas hoje são os impactos ambientais globais. A questão da mudança climática, já foi dito, o senhor reafirmou, inclusive lembrou dos fósseis que estão saindo do degelo para nos mostrar que o problema é grave. Então, eu queria fazer uma pergunta, 2 perguntas. Uma pessoal. Como o senhor, um ambientalista norte-americano, se sente diante do fato do seu governo e dos congressistas norte-americanos não terem ratificado a convenção que busca dar uma solução global para o problema? E segundo, o que o seu instituto está fazendo para mudar e influenciar o governo norte-americano e o Congresso norte-americano para que os Estados Unidos ratifique a convenção?
On the first point, the failure of the U.S. government to ratify the Kyoto Convention on Kyoto Protocol on climate is, to me, embarrassing. We have the most sophisticated climate research in the United States of any country in the world. Most of the computer models that simulate the effects of CO2 on the climate are U.S. models. We have the information. We have leading scientists. But our politicians, especially in the Congress, are lagging far behind the people. And my guess is that one of these days, they're going to realize that the people on the street are going to say, you know, something's happening. Everyone's going to know that climate's changing, and we'll still have the Congress acting as though nothing is happening. So that could change quickly, and this is an area where government can play an important role. Just before the Kyoto conference 2 years ago now, the White House realized that the American people were not really on board on this issue, would not support the kind of steps were needed. So that they actually had a couple of press conferences. They had a handful of leading scientists talk about climate change to a huge press conference, what we know, what we don't know, what the risks are, and what we ought to be doing. That was an important step in the right direction, trying to raise the level of public understanding. And then they had another session for the TV weather news forecasters who give the weather for the next day or the next week or whatever, had them in and talk with them about it, so that when they were reporting a heat wave, they could put it in the context of global warming. It wouldn't just be an aberration of some sort. This, in a world where things are changing very rapidly, I think governments have a responsibility for public education through the media that they did not have before.
O tempo está acabando, eu vou fazer uma última pergunta, mas antes eu gostaria de lembrar aos telespectadores que as publicações do World Watch Institute, o Estado do Mundo, a revista e outras publicações podem ser acessadas pelo endereço na internet, que está aí no vídeo, e também pelo telefone da organização aqui no Brasil. A minha questão final é a seguinte: esse seu, o mais recente livro, O Estado do Mundo, diversos capítulos começam com previsões mal sucedidas do final do século passado. Previsões que falavam, por exemplo, sobre as perspectivas do automóvel, outras sobre quais seriam os usos do petróleo, etc. De todo modo, como nós estamos chegando no final de um século e no começo de um novo milênio, eu queria lhe pedir, na certeza de que o senhor é um homem que acredita na força das ideias e das teses, senão não estaria aqui defendendo essa bandeira, que pudesse traçar qual é o horizonte que o senhor imagina para o mundo nesse novo milênio, sabendo que estará certamente correndo o risco de fazer uma previsão que o futuro vai demonstrar que não será correta. Mas, enfim, acho que o risco vale a pena.
One of the things we've done in State of the World 1999, which is our millennial edition, was to sort of look back over the last century as a basis for looking ahead. Not that we can project for the next century, but to give a sense of where things are headed. What we see is what I've come to describe as the acceleration of history. Things are moving very, very fast now. In traditional societies, for example, the elderly members of the tribe or the village were the ones who had the wisdom, because they'd been around a long time, and they passed that wisdom on to successive generations, to the younger members of society. Today, things are changing so fast that very often in the information economy, for example, it's the youngest people who have the knowledge, and they transmit it to the older people. We just hired a woman to be our webmaster who's 23 years old. She's almost fresh out of school, but she knows so much more about it than the more senior members of our staff that we have to go to young people. So I mention this because the acceleration of change is coming so rapidly now, whether we're looking at climate or whether we're looking at the composition of plant and animal life on Earth, or whether we're looking at what's happening with water tables, with new infectious diseases like the HIV virus. Things are happening so fast that we're having trouble responding to them quickly enough. And it's this sense of accelerating change that is beginning to concern us. I mean, scientists were saying 40 years ago that the possibility of new infectious diseases decimating populations was very real. And they didn't know when or what form, but they sensed it was coming. We now are seeing one of those infectious diseases decimate the population of sub-Saharan Africa, for example. When we started the World Watch Institute just 25 years ago, global warming was a scientific hypothesis. We now have evidence of global warming. The 15 warmest years in the last century have come since 1980, so the trend is quite clear. So it's this acceleration of history and the capacity of us as individuals and particularly of our political institutions to adjust to it that is my principal concern. And in this process, information becomes, fresh, up-to-date information becomes terribly central to guiding the process of change and directing the response to the threats like global warming or the HIV epidemic or falling water tables. So the role of the communications media now is far more important than it has ever been before, because historically the role of the communications media was to provide news. But now, with things happening so quickly, we have to educate a generation of adults about global warming. When I was in school, global warming was never mentioned because no one even thought about it. So we have to educate ourselves, and the communications media is the only institution that societies have for quickly raising the level of public understanding to the point where it will support effective policy responses, as to global warming, for example. So I simply want to commend you and our colleagues here on this program today for focusing on this set of issues. I happen to think it is a set of issues that is going to shape the future of human civilization. So thank you very much.
Nós é que agradecemos a oportunidade desse debate aqui, desses esclarecimentos da sua parte. Eu agradeço muito a presença de todos os entrevistadores, a você que está em casa. E na próxima segunda-feira, sempre às 10h30 da noite, mais um Roda Viva. Uma boa noite, uma boa semana e até lá.